He walked into the bakery to buy an engagement cake, and instead found the woman he once loved holding a little girl who looked exactly like him. And in that moment, the life he built began to fall apart. The moment Ethan Winslow pushed open the door of the small bakery on Maple Street, his entire future, carefully designed, perfectly arranged, and strategically planned, began to crack in a way he couldn't yet understand. He had come for something simple, something almost embarrassingly mundane for a man of his status, an engagement cake. A symbolic piece of sugar and flour to seal a deal between two powerful families. But the sweet smell of vanilla, caramel, and warm dough hit him like a memory he had sworn he'd buried long ago. The bell above the door chimed, light and innocent, but Ethan felt tension rise in his chest as if the sound were a warning. He stepped inside, tall, impeccably dressed, the embodiment of a millionaire CEO who never lost control. Even the soft winter sunlight reflecting off his blonde hair made him look almost unreal, like a man sculpted specifically for success. He rehearsed his order in his mind, wanting nothing more than to get this done quickly and return to his world where emotions were unnecessary and predictable outcomes were guaranteed. But the universe had no intention of letting him leave unshaken. Because she was there. Behind the counter, in a crisp white baker's uniform smudged with a touch of flour near the collarbone, stood Harper Morgan. His Harper. The woman he once loved with a naive certainty that felt impossible in the cold, structured life he lived now. Her brown hair was tied into a loose ponytail that left a few strands falling softly near her cheeks, and her blue eyes, those same eyes he used to trace with his fingertips, lifted to meet his. For a moment, she froze too. Not dramatically, not with horror, but with the stunned stillness of someone who believed the past was gone forever only to find it standing 3 feet away wearing a tailored coat and a watch worth more than a small apartment. Before Ethan could speak, before he could even swallow the sudden dryness in his throat, movement caught his eye. A tiny girl, no older than 3, nestled on Harper's hip. Blonde hair that glowed under the bakery lights. Blue eyes bright enough to steal the air from his lungs. A pink dress. And on her head, slightly crooked, a miniature baker's hat that made her look like she had stepped out of a storybook. The little girl blinked at him with such open curiosity that something inside Ethan twisted sharply. She wasn't just cute or charming or unexpectedly present. She was familiar. Too familiar. Harper shifted slightly, tightening her hold on the child as if bracing herself for impact. Ethan's heart hammered, and for the first time in years he felt genuinely unprepared. His world relied on numbers, forecasts, mergers, calculated decisions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. He opened his mouth, unsure of what he meant to say, unsure if he could say anything at all. The bakery around him hummed with soft music, warm lights, and the comforting scent of pastries, yet he felt as if the ground beneath him had tilted. Harper's voice broke the silence first, gentle but strained. "Hello, Ethan." It was all it took for his carefully built composure to begin to fall apart, and for a shocking, electrifying question to form in the back of his mind, one he didn't dare voice but couldn't escape. Why did that little girl look so much like him? Ethan struggled to gather himself as Harper's greeting settled into the warm, vanilla-scented air. He had imagined this moment countless times in restless nights years ago, back when he still allowed himself the weakness of wondering what her life had become, but none of those imaginings came close to the raw truth of seeing her now. She looked older in the way people do when they've lived through storms rather than time, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before, something both calming and distant at once. And then there was the child, her daughter, watching him with open fascination, clutching the fabric of Harper's uniform with one tiny hand while the other toyed with the strap of the baker's hat on her head. Harper managed a small, polite smile, the kind people use when they aren't sure whether to run or pretend everything is fine. Ethan forced himself to breathe, to return the smile, to remember how conversations were supposed to work, but his attention kept pulling back to the girl. She was studying him with a seriousness far beyond her age, as if she were trying to decide who he was before anyone introduced him. Harper noticed his gaze and instinctively shifted the little girl slightly behind her, not protectively, but in a way that revealed she had learned to anticipate the world's unpredictability. "I didn't expect to see you here," Harper said quietly, smoothing the child's hair. "The store isn't exactly on your usual route." Ethan tried to answer lightly, but the words came out rougher than he intended. "I'm here to order a cake. For my engagement." The last word tasted heavier than it should have, and Harper's fingers paused for the briefest heartbeat before she continued straightening her daughter's baker's hat. She didn't congratulate him. She didn't ask for details. She simply nodded, her expression controlled but not cold, and he realized that she had become skilled at containing emotions he once knew by heart. The little girl leaned forward on Harper's arm, still staring at him with disarming openness. "Your eyes are like mine," she announced with the gentle confidence only a small child could possess. Her voice was soft and melodic, carrying no suspicion or fear, just pure, honest observation. The world around Ethan seemed to dim for a moment. Harper's breath hitched, her shoulders stiffening. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling something powerful and unfamiliar surge in his chest. He wasn't sure whether it was shock or recognition or both tangled into something impossible to ignore. Harper touched the child's back gently, trying to redirect her attention, but the girl kept looking at him, waiting for a response. "What's your name?" Ethan managed, his voice unsteady in a way he hoped neither of them would notice. "Lily," the girl said proudly, pressing her cheek against Harper's shoulder. Ethan repeated the name silently, committing it to memory with an intensity that startled him. Lily. A simple name, beautiful and soft, and now lodged in a part of him he hadn't known was still alive. Harper cleared her throat. "She's at that age where she notices everything," she said, avoiding his gaze as she spoke. "Don't take it personally." But how could he not? The resemblance was undeniable. The timing was impossible to ignore. And the way Harper said the words, careful, measured, almost rehearsed, told him she had imagined this moment too, but with far more dread than hope. Ethan felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing against his ribs. He wanted to ask who the father was, wanted to demand answers he knew he had no right to demand, wanted to step closer to see her face more clearly, to hear her laugh, to understand why his heart reacted so violently to a child he had just met. But he held himself still, aware that one wrong word could shatter the fragile civility between them. Harper finally looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet resolve. "Lily is my daughter," she said, her voice steady but soft, as if she were bracing herself for his reaction. And even though she didn't give him any more information than that, Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him again. Something was unfolding here, something deeper, heavier, and far more life-altering than a simple reunion. And although Harper clearly wanted to maintain control of the moment, Ethan knew, with sudden clarity, that the truth hovering between them would not stay buried for long. Ethan left the bakery that day carrying nothing but questions, yet each one felt heavier than the last. In the back seat of his car, with the city blurring past the windows, he found himself pulled backward in time to the years he had tried so hard to forget. People like to imagine that the wealthy and ambitious carved their futures cleanly, neatly, without hesitation, but the truth was that Ethan had once stood at a crossroads trembling with uncertainty. 3 years earlier, he had been offered the kind of position that could transform a promising executive into a corporate titan, a role that demanded absolute loyalty, relentless focus, and sacrifices he wasn't supposed to hesitate to make. The promotion came with a warning disguised as advice: anything that distracted him would jeopardize his ascent. And among those distractions, they meant relationships, especially ones rooted in real emotion rather than convenience. Back then, Harper had been a dreamer with sleeves dusted in flour and notebooks filled with half-tested recipes. She would show him sketches of pastries in the margins of her textbooks and talk endlessly about opening her own bakery, a place filled with light, color, warmth, and the kind of desserts that made people feel less alone. She was passionate and imaginative, a contrast to his polished, measured world. He admired her fiercely for it, even envied her at times, but he also believed that love could wait while opportunity could not. When the company's board flew him to New York for meetings that stretched until dawn, when he was told that his future required clean lines and clean decisions, he chose the path that seemed logical. He told Harper they needed space. He told himself it was temporary. He told everyone else it was necessary. He didn't see how deeply it gutted her until it was too late. Harper didn't beg him to stay or argue or cry on the night they ended things. She simply listened, nodded slowly, and whispered that she hoped he would get everything he wanted. That quiet grace should have reassured him. Instead, it left him feeling like he'd walked away from something irreplaceable. She moved out of their shared apartment within a week, leaving behind nothing but a folded apron and a handwritten recipe for cinnamon brioche that still smelled faintly of her perfume. Ethan buried himself in work until exhaustion blurred the days together, convincing himself that ambition required a little emotional amputation. And because Harper hadn't reached out and he hadn't dared to call, they drifted apart as if the years they spent together had been a brief, impossible dream. But there were moments, rare, unwelcome moments, when the memories pierced him unexpectedly. Passing a bakery on a corner. Catching the scent of vanilla while walking through a hotel lobby. Listening to someone laugh with that same breathless joy Harper used to have when she perfected a new recipe. He would push those memories aside quickly, claiming he didn't have time to dwell on what was over, yet some part of him always wondered what her life had become and whether she had found someone who supported her the way he failed to. Now, sitting alone in his office with the city skyline glowing behind him, Ethan felt all those buried regrets rising like a tide he could no longer hold back. Harper had a daughter. A little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. A little girl whose smile had struck him with a familiarity he couldn't explain away. He pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady his breathing, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces aligned with frightening precision. Harper's silence. Her sudden disappearance from his world. The timing that didn't feel coincidental anymore. The small, startled shadow in her eyes when Lily said they looked alike. He remembered the last night they spent together before he took the promotion, a night both tender and heartbreaking because neither of them admitted they felt the end approaching. That night kept replaying in his mind now, looping insistently, as though urging him to confront something he had spent years running from. If Lily was his daughter, if he had missed her first words, first steps, first everything, then the life he believed he had under control was built on a void he never knew existed. He stood and paced the room as the realization settled deeper, heavier. Harper had raised that little girl alone. She had carried the burden of a secret while he climbed corporate ladders and posed for magazine covers that praised him for his discipline and clarity. But if she had truly believed he deserved to know, she would have found him. Which meant she must have convinced herself that Ethan Winslow, the man he used to be, wouldn't have chosen them even if he had been told. That thought alone sliced through him with a quiet brutality he wasn't prepared for. For the first time in a long while, Ethan wondered whether the greatest mistake of his life wasn't the relationship he abandoned, but the version of himself he allowed the world to shape. He had become everything his mentors admired, efficient, powerful, emotionally unreachable, but at what cost? And now, as the truth edged closer, he felt the old world he had spent years constructing begin to tremble under the weight of something far more human and infinitely more terrifying: responsibility, connection, and the possibility that his choices had left scars deeper than he ever imagined. He didn't know yet how to face Harper, didn't know what questions he had the right to ask or whether she would even allow him to be part of the conversation. But one thing had become painfully clear: whatever future he thought he had planned was no longer solid. It was shifting, reshaping itself around a revelation he could neither escape nor ignore. And somewhere out there was a little girl with bright blue eyes who might be linked to him in a way that would change everything. Ethan returned to the bakery 2 days later, though he told himself it was only because he needed to finalize the details of the engagement cake. It was a weak excuse, flimsy enough that even his assistant raised an eyebrow when he cleared his schedule for the morning, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He needed clarity, answers, something tangible to ground the whirlwind of thoughts that had been consuming him since the moment he saw Lily's bright blue eyes. The memory of that tiny voice telling him they looked alike had replayed in his mind with relentless persistence, leaving him restless at night and unfocused at work. Even Cassandra, his fiancée, had noticed his distraction and questioned him at dinner, but Ethan evaded her inquiries with a practiced ease that left him feeling unexpectedly hollow. When he stepped inside Sugar Bloom again, the familiar chime of the doorbell carried a weight it hadn't before. The warm, sweet scent of baked goods wrapped around him quickly, but instead of offering comfort, it heightened his tension. Harper was working behind the counter, her hair pulled into a neat bun this time, her uniform crisp and clean, but exhaustion lingered subtly around her eyes. Lily was perched on a small stool nearby, drawing with bright crayons on a sheet of parchment paper, humming softly as she worked. Harper noticed Ethan first, her posture stiffening imperceptibly, though she forced a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Back again?" she asked gently, though there was a trace of wariness beneath the surface. Before he could respond, Lily looked up from her drawing and beamed with innocent delight. "Hi," she chirped, lifting her paper to show him a colorful scribble that resembled a cupcake wearing sunglasses. Ethan felt the tightness in his chest ease just slightly, surprised by how instinctively he smiled back. He approached slowly, aware of Harper's watchful gaze. "That's very impressive," he said softly, studying Lily's drawing. "Are you an artist?" She giggled, nodding proudly before returning to her coloring with determined focus. Harper stepped closer, as if grounding herself before whatever conversation she sensed was coming. "If you're here for the cake, I've already started working on the design," she said, her voice controlled, professional, but undeniably tense. Ethan nodded, though that wasn't what had brought him back. He took a quiet breath, searching for words that wouldn't shatter the fragile space between them. "Harper," he began carefully, "can we talk? Not about the cake. About that day." Her eyes flickered briefly, betraying the storm behind them. She set down the spatula she'd been holding, wiping her hands on a towel with slow precision. "Ethan, I don't think there's anything to discuss," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "You came in for a cake. I gave you the details. That's all." But Ethan wasn't willing to accept that anymore. He glanced toward Lily, who was now humming to herself again, oblivious to the rising tension between the adults. "She looks like me," he said quietly, his voice almost breaking under the weight of the words. Harper inhaled sharply, her shoulders tightening as if absorbing a physical blow. "Harper, please. I need to know." The room seemed to shrink around them, the warm bakery lights dimming beneath the intensity of the moment. Harper stared at him for a long time, her expression shifting between fear, anger, and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Finally, she let out a slow breath and leaned against the counter, as though standing upright had become too heavy. "The truth is complicated," she murmured, keeping her voice low enough that Lily wouldn't hear. "And I don't want to have this conversation while she's right here." Ethan nodded immediately, understanding more in what she didn't say than in what she did. But Harper wasn't finished. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength before looking at him with a vulnerability that struck him harder than any accusation could have. "You walked away from us before you even knew there was an U.S. I never wanted to burden you with something you never asked for," she whispered. "I had no reason to believe you'd stay, even if I told you." Ethan felt the words sink into him with a slow, crushing ache. He opened his mouth to respond, but Harper shook her head, silencing him gently. "I'll tell you everything," she promised quietly, "but not now. Not in front of her. Give me a little time." He nodded again, though waiting felt almost unbearable. Still, he understood the gravity of what she was offering, the truth he had spent days fearing and craving in equal measure. As he prepared to leave, Lily rushed over, holding out another drawing, this one a stick figure with blonde hair and big blue circles for eyes. "This is you," she declared proudly, and something inside Ethan cracked completely. When he stepped outside, the sunlight felt harsher, the air colder, and the weight of reality heavier than ever. He had come for a cake, but everything in his life was beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread, pulled loose by the innocent smile of a child who didn't yet know the chaos she'd awakened. Ethan barely slept in the days that followed, lying awake in the dark with the city lights flickering across his ceiling like restless thoughts that refused to dim. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face, round, bright, angelic, and each time, the resemblance struck him with a force that felt almost cruel. He replayed his past with Harper over and over again, searching for moments he might have overlooked, signs he should have noticed, words she might have tried to say. But the truth was painfully simple: he hadn't been listening back then, too consumed by ambition to imagine that life could unfold in ways not outlined in his 5-year plan. Now that neglect was echoing back at him in the shape of a little girl who might be his daughter. His confusion deepened into something heavier, a blend of guilt, fear, and a fierce longing he hadn't expected. He wanted answers, yes, but more than that, he wanted to understand what had happened to the woman he once loved and what burdens she had carried alone. His fiancée, Cassandra, noticed his distance almost immediately. At a charity gala, she nudged him sharply when he didn't respond to a question from a senator's wife, her smile brittle as she whispered that he needed to pull himself together. Later that evening, she asked if he was having doubts about the wedding, but he brushed her off with a practiced charm that rang hollow even to his own ears. Standing beside Cassandra, surrounded by gold champagne flutes and staged laughter, Ethan felt like he was living inside a glass case, well-lit, admired, and completely suffocating. Harper's small bakery, with its soft music and imperfect warmth, suddenly felt more real than anything in his polished world. On the 4th morning, unable to endure another hour of speculation, Ethan drove back to Sugar Bloom. The shop hadn't opened yet, but Harper was inside prepping dough at a stainless steel counter dusted in flour. She looked tired, her hair slightly undone, her posture tense. Lily was in the back room, playing with measuring cups as if they were musical instruments. When Harper noticed Ethan at the door, her eyes widened in surprise, then softened with resignation. She let him in without a word and locked the door behind him, creating a fragile cocoon of privacy. They stood in silence for a moment, each waiting for the other to begin. Harper wiped her hands on a flour-covered towel before meeting his gaze with quiet determination. "You want the truth," she said, her voice steadier than he expected. "And you deserve to hear it. But you need to know that it's not as simple as you might think." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Just tell me, Harper. I can handle it." She shook her head slightly. "Handling it isn't the problem. Accepting the consequences is." She moved to the counter, as if she needed something solid to lean on. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the back room, where Lily was humming to herself, unaware of how her existence was reshaping everything. "When you left," Harper began slowly, "I told myself it was the right thing. You had dreams that didn't include small-town bakeries or the kind of messy life most people have. I knew you were choosing a future that demanded every part of you, and I didn't want to be the reason you hesitated. But a few weeks after you were gone, I started feeling sick. I thought it was stress or the grief of losing someone I cared about, but it didn't go away." She paused, her breath catching slightly. "Then I found out I was pregnant." Ethan's heart lurched. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. Harper continued before he could gather himself. "I wasn't ready. I was terrified. And I was alone. But even then, I didn't call you. Not because I wanted to keep her from you, but because I knew what your life had become. I had watched you change during those last months together, your focus narrowing, your priorities shifting, your world filling up with people who expected you to become someone bigger, sharper, more ruthless. I convinced myself that you wouldn't want this. That you wouldn't want her. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. And I wasn't going to beg for a place in a life you'd already chosen without me. Ethan stepped closer, trying to steady his voice. Harper, I should have known. I should have been there. You shouldn't have had to do this alone. She looked away, pain tightening her features. That's the thing, Ethan. I didn't think you wanted to be there. I thought telling you would force you into a life you didn't want, and I couldn't be the person who trapped you. So I stayed silent. I built a life around her. And I told myself that I made the right decision. A long, weighted pause settled between them. Ethan felt the truth hit him with a sharp, irreversible force. Harper hadn't been hiding Lily out of spite, she had been protecting herself, protecting her daughter, and perhaps even protecting him from a version of fatherhood he might have resented. But fate had thrown them back into each other's lives anyway, shattering every assumption they had made to survive the past 3 years. Ethan finally found his voice, low and raw. I want to be in her life, Harper. I don't care how complicated it is. I don't care what it costs. I want to know her. I want to know you again. I want to fix what I broke. Harper's expression flickered, torn between hope and fear. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the back room where Lily began singing an off-key nursery rhyme, blissfully unaware of how her little voice had changed the trajectory of everything. You can try, Harper whispered at last, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the counter. But nothing will ever be the same again. And for the first time, Ethan didn't flinch from the weight of that truth. He welcomed it. Ethan left the bakery that morning with the truth burning in his chest like a fire he couldn't smother. Harper's words had rooted themselves so deeply in him that the drive back to his penthouse felt surreal, as though he were navigating 2 different worlds at once. In one world, he was still the disciplined CEO preparing for an engagement that promised strategic alliances and polished perfection. In the other, he had just discovered that a little girl with blue eyes and flower-dusted cheeks might be the piece of his life he had unknowingly been missing. The contrast between those worlds became impossible to ignore by the time he reached the lobby of his building, where sleek marble floors and faint classical music suddenly felt cold, sterile, and profoundly disconnected from the warmth he had just left behind. Cassandra was waiting for him upstairs, ready to discuss wedding details with a binder full of fabric swatches, seating charts, and partnerships disguised as invitations. She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a comment about how late he was, but Ethan hardly heard her. As she spoke, outlining how their union would benefit both families and how the press coverage would be impeccable if they handled it correctly, he watched her with a strange, growing clarity. Cassandra was beautiful, composed, brilliant in the way ambitious people are when their lives are built like equations, but she had never looked at him the way Harper once did, never with softness, never with wonder, never with anything except strategic expectation. He felt suddenly suffocated by the immaculate space around them and the weight of a future that felt less like a life and more like a prescription. When Cassandra finally paused long enough to notice his silence, she frowned, closing the binder with a sharp snap. "You're distracted again," she said irritably, crossing her arms. "This is the 3rd time this week. Are you having doubts, Ethan?" Her tone was clipped, not wounded, more irritated than concerned, as though his hesitation were an inconvenience rather than a matter of emotion. Ethan rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the tension radiate through him. "It's not doubts," he answered, though he realized as he spoke that this wasn't entirely true. "There are things happening that I need to sort through." Cassandra raised an eyebrow. "Things? What kind of things?" He hesitated, knowing she expected concrete explanations, but the truth was too delicate and too new to lay before someone who saw relationships as transactions. "Personal things," he said quietly, and Cassandra's expression shifted immediately into annoyance. She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Ethan, we don't have room for personal crises right now. The merger depends on this wedding." Do you understand how many people are counting on us? Something inside him cracked. He looked at Cassandra, not at the woman he was supposed to marry, but at the version of himself he would have to become to stay with her. A version that required numbness, obedience, and a heart kept far from anything unpredictable or real. He couldn't do it anymore. Not after seeing Harper. Not after learning about Lily. Not after realizing that his future had already shifted without his permission, pulling him toward a life he had abandoned before it even began. He took a slow breath and met Cassandra's gaze without flinching. "The wedding isn't going to happen," he said, and the simplicity of the statement startled even him. Cassandra stared at him for several seconds, her expression unreadable, until a sharp laugh escaped her lips. "You're joking," she said, stepping back as if he'd told her something absurd. But Ethan didn't waver. "I'm not." The air in the room grew taut, thick with disbelief and anger. Cassandra's laughter died, replaced by a cold fury that sharpened every line of her face. "Is this about another woman?" she demanded. "Because if you think you can throw everything away for someone meaningless." "She's not meaningless," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. It shocked Cassandra enough that she stopped speaking. He swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. "Her name is Harper. And she has a daughter. A little girl who might be mine." Cassandra's eyes widened, and for the first time, he saw genuine astonishment break through her controlled demeanor. "You have a child," she whispered, as though the very idea scandalized her more than the end of the wedding. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know that yet. But I intend to find out. And I intend to be part of her life if she is." Cassandra stepped back slowly, her breath unsteady with outrage. "You're throwing away everything we built for a child you didn't even know existed? For a woman who left you?" Ethan exhaled, feeling the truth settle comfortably, solidly inside him. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing the right thing for the first time in a long time." Cassandra stared at him as if she no longer recognized him at all. Then, without another word, she grabbed her binder and walked out, her heels snapping like small explosions with every step. When the door slammed behind her, Ethan felt a wave of unexpected relief crash over him. For years, he had moved through life like a machine engineered for success, but in that moment, he finally felt human again, fallible, frightened, hopeful. Later that evening, as he stood by the window overlooking the city that once defined him, he realized that the future he wanted wasn't built in boardrooms or ballrooms. It was waiting in a small bakery on Maple Street, where a little girl with blue eyes drew cupcakes with crayons and a woman he once lost still carried pieces of his heart she never asked for. And for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't afraid of what came next. He was ready for it. Ethan began showing up at Sugar Bloom with a consistency that surprised even him, though he tried not to make it obvious by spacing out his visits at first. Yet no matter how hard he attempted to disguise his intentions, Harper always seemed to sense when he entered the bakery. Her back would straighten, her hands would still for a fraction of a second, and her eyes would soften in a way that suggested resignation mixed with something far more complicated. Lily, on the other hand, reacted to him with effortless enthusiasm. She would squeal his name, sometimes mispronouncing it into a two-syllable melody, and run to him with her tiny arms outstretched, leaving flowery fingerprints on his expensive suits that he wore afterward like badges of honor rather than inconveniences. Every time she reached for him, something inside Ethan stirred with a fierce tenderness that he couldn't fully explain, though he knew better than to push Harper for answers she wasn't ready to give. As days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself helping with small tasks around the bakery, moving flour bags, fixing a flickering light, restocking sugar jars, though he knew Harper could do all of it herself. Still, she let him help without protest, and that small permission felt monumental. In the quiet hours before closing, he would linger, sitting on a wooden stool while Harper decorated pastries with steady, practiced movements. Lily often sat on his lap, tired from the day, her head resting on his chest as she drifted between wakefulness and dreams. Ethan had never imagined that a child could fall asleep so easily against him, trusting him completely without requiring any proof of who he was. The first time she did it, he barely moved for nearly an hour, afraid to disturb the fragile sense of belonging warming his heart. The more time he spent with them, the more vividly he realized how much life he had missed. Lily had a stubborn streak, a playful mischief, and a laugh so bright it seemed to refill the room with sunlight each time she let it loose. Harper possessed the same gentle resilience he remembered, but now it was tempered by maturity and a strength that came from navigating hardship alone. Her dreams had not vanished, instead, she had molded them around circumstances that would have broken many others. Watching her work, flour on her hands, concentration etched on her brow, lips curved in quiet satisfaction whenever she perfected a design, pulled Ethan into a world that felt warmer and more real than anything he had ever built in the corporate towers of his success. Yet beneath the sweetness of these new routines, doubt lingered between them like a shadow that neither wanted to acknowledge. Harper still kept her guard up, not harshly, but with the careful restraint of someone who had been forced to rebuild trust one cautious piece at a time. Sometimes, when she caught him watching Lily with barely contained wonder, she would look away quickly, as though protecting herself from the hope she feared might betray her again. Ethan understood her caution, even respected it, but his desire to prove himself grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly, drenching the streets and rattling the windows with gusts of wind. The bakery's closing hour had already passed, but Harper hadn't asked him to leave, and Lily had fallen asleep early, curled atop a pile of aprons in the back room. Harper was washing dishes, her movements slower than usual, and Ethan sensed something heavy on her mind. He approached softly, leaning against the counter beside her. "You're quiet today," he said, not accusingly, but with honest concern. Harper kept her eyes on the soapy water for a moment before answering. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next," she murmured. "For Lily. For myself. For you." Her voice trembled slightly, and Ethan felt the urge to take her hand, though he restrained himself. She set down a plate, rinsed it carefully, and dried her hands before finally facing him. "I never planned for any of this," she admitted. "I built a life around Lily that made sense, even if it wasn't easy. And now you're here, and you're different from the man you used to be, and I don't know what that means." Ethan inhaled slowly, choosing his words with the kind of precision he usually reserved for multimillion-dollar negotiations. "It means I'm trying," he said quietly. "Not to fix everything in one day. Not to undo the past. Just to be here. To show you that I'm not walking away again." Harper's eyes searched his, and for the first time since their reunion, she didn't look away immediately. The vulnerability that flickered across her face was so raw, so honest, that Ethan felt humbled by the trust she was letting surface, even in such a fragile form. "Lily adores you," she whispered. "She doesn't understand who you might be yet, but she feels something. Children are perceptive." Ethan swallowed hard, both moved and terrified by what her words implied. Harper stepped a little closer, lowering her voice even further. "If you're going to be in her life, Ethan, you have to be consistent. You can't disappear when things get complicated. You can't make promises you won't keep. She's never known what it feels like to lose someone she trusts. I won't let her learn that from you." He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded with a conviction that rose from a place deeper than logic or pride. "I won't leave," he said, each word spoken with steady certainty. "I made mistakes before, but I'm not that man anymore. I don't want a life built on deals and expectations. I want something real. I want the chance to know her, and to earn back whatever place I lost in your life." Harper's eyes softened, glistening with emotions she struggled to contain. For a moment, it seemed she might reach for him, but then Lily stirred in the back room, releasing a soft whimper. Harper turned instinctively, maternal instinct guiding her before thought could intervene. Ethan watched her kneel beside the little girl, brushing her hair gently and whispering soothing words until she settled again. The sight cut through whatever doubts remained in him. This was where he wanted to be, where he should have been all along. The storm outside intensified, but inside the bakery, he felt an unusual sense of calm, as though something long fragmented was finally beginning to piece itself together. And as Harper returned to stand beside him, her expression no longer guarded but cautiously hopeful, Ethan knew he was ready to fight for a future he once believed he didn't deserve. A future with them. Ethan arrived at Sugar Bloom earlier than usual that evening, long after the rainstorm had passed and the streets glistened with reflections of warm shop lights. He told himself he had come to help Harper close up, but the truth was that anticipation had been tugging at him since dawn, urging him forward with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When he stepped inside, the bakery was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of Lily giggling behind the counter as she tried to stack cupcake liners into a tower. Harper looked up from wiping a table and greeted him with a smile that was no longer guarded, though still tinged with caution. Something in her expression, however, hinted that she had made peace with the idea of him being present, at least for this moment. They worked together in an easy rhythm, sweeping the floors, organizing displays, and washing the last of the mixing bowls. Ethan found himself glancing at Harper every now and then, watching the way she moved through the space with quiet ownership and a kind of grace born not from elegance but from resilience. Lily eventually tired and toddled over to him, lifting her arms in a silent request. Without hesitation, he scooped her up, feeling her tiny hands curl into the fabric of his shirt as she rested her head on his shoulder. Harper watched the scene unfold with a softness that made Ethan's heart clench, because it wasn't the distant sadness he had sometimes seen on her face, it was a small but unmistakable glimmer of hope. When the last light was turned off in the front display and Lily was tucked onto a blanket with her stuffed bear, Harper gestured for Ethan to follow her into the backyard of the bakery. He hadn't noticed it before, hidden behind a wooden gate, but the moment he stepped outside, he felt as if he'd entered another world. String lights hung across the narrow courtyard, casting a warm glow on the brick walls and wooden crates repurposed as planters. A faint scent of herbs mingled with the lingering sweetness of baked sugar drifting from inside. Harper folded her arms, not out of defensiveness but from a reluctance to expose the vulnerability she carried into this conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began quietly, her voice steady yet fragile. "About being here. About wanting to know Lily. About wanting to fix things between us." She paused, drawing a slow breath. "You have changed, Ethan. And I see it now. But change doesn't erase the past, and it doesn't guarantee the future. I need to know that you understand how big this is, not just for you, but for her. And for me." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but unwavering. "Harper, I understand that I failed you before. I made choices that hurt you, choices that pushed me away from the life I should have fought for. I can't erase any of that. But I can choose differently now. I can choose you both, not out of guilt or obligation, but because I want a life that's real. I want to be someone Lily can depend on. I want to earn your trust back, not through promises, but through actions." Harper's eyes shone with emotion, though she didn't look away. "And what about your old life?" she asked. "Your company, your responsibilities, the world you used to believe in?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Those things don't mean what they used to. They feel empty without something genuine to anchor them. I'm not walking away from my career, but it's no longer the thing I'm choosing above everything else. I've lived that way, and it nearly cost me my soul. I'm done living like a ghost in a glass tower." She studied him for a long moment, searching for the cracks, the false notes, the signs of a temporary transformation. But instead she found sincerity, a steady warmth, and a man who seemed profoundly humbled by the second chance fate had unexpectedly placed in front of him. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out a folded sheet of paper covered in handwritten notes and bakery sketches. Ethan recognized her handwriting immediately, the same loops and flourishes he used to admire when she scribbled recipes on napkins in their old apartment. "I started planning a bigger bakery years ago," she admitted softly. "Not because I thought it would happen anytime soon, but because imagining it made the hard days easier." She unfolded the paper, smoothing the creases with her fingertips. "I never showed this to anyone. It felt too personal, too fragile. But if we're really going to try this, then you should see it." Ethan accepted the paper with reverence, as though she had handed him a piece of her heart. He studied the sketches: wide windows, rows of display cases, a small play corner for children, and notes about seasonal flavors written in the margins. His chest tightened with emotion he didn't bother hiding. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "And I want to help you build it. Not to take it over. Not to control it. Just to give you the support you deserved all along." Harper's breath trembled, and for a moment she looked as if she might break down, but instead she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Then let's take it slow," she murmured. "For Lily's sake. For mine. For yours. Let's see where this goes without rushing or forcing anything." Ethan nodded, overwhelmed with relief. "Slow is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then, to his surprise, Harper leaned in and gently pressed her forehead against his chest. It wasn't a kiss, nor a declaration, but the quietest, most profound acceptance he could have wished for. He wrapped his arms around her slowly, carefully, as if he were holding something fragile and irreplaceable. In that moment, surrounded by the glow of string lights and the faint sound of Lily stirring inside, Ethan realized that everything he had once thought defined him, success, wealth, reputation, felt insignificant compared to the simple truth blooming between them. This, right here, was a beginning. When Harper finally lifted her head, her eyes sparkled with a softness he hadn't seen in years. "Welcome home, Ethan," she whispered, echoing the words she hadn't dared speak aloud before. And for the first time in a long time, he truly felt like he was